Good evening. I'm wearing my Sherlock Holmes hat. This is not the proper way to wear it because we're exploring the world of TESOL, PE 424. I know I'm trying to be a little more dynamic here so I don't put myself to sleep. You don't want to see that. Well, I have this handout, and you'll have to click a link to get it because you can read it in color, no need to print it out, on your screen. And so what were some things we're going to be looking at? Well, 2 or 3 major resource items, 3 actually, that you can go online to that are important if you're an ESL teacher. And then we're going to look a bit about how language is taught, and then a little bit about how Stephen Krashen talks about language instruction, how languages are acquired. He says they're not really learned, they're acquired. And also a little video at the end with Mrs. Amin teaching a class. And you'll probably say, what is that? And it will, you don't have to watch all these videos in great detail, except, of course, this one. I know being online is very tempting. Your only homework this week is a discussion entry for next week. But I'm very sincere. I want you to look at this material. I'm trying to cut down, just give you the stuff that's important. Okay, so on this handout, talks about week 2. And the first, I have the TESOL website in color. And you'll be able to go to it. It's TESOL, TESOL.org. TESOL is the kind of the original international and national organization of teaching English as a second language. In fact, it means teaching English to speakers of other languages. That's what the SOL is. And the website is very comprehensive. You can become a member. It's kind of expensive, but if you're a teacher or a student, it's quite a bit cheaper. What do you get from this? Well, if you want to teach internationally, you really have to join TESOL because that's what ESL teachers that are serious internationally know about, and they talk about it. So if you're looking for just do something in a limited way overseas, you may not need TESOL. But if you work in a professional organization or a group overseas where it's, a private school or a school that emphasizes, puts a lot of pressure to produce language learners, good English speakers and writers, then TESOL is going to be central to their curriculum. Okay, so you can see upcoming events. They're going to be having they have a national and international meeting every year. Most of those meetings are going to be in the United States or Canada, the international, but sometimes they're in Central America, like Panama, or they could be in Hawaii is a very popular destination for people from Asia. So that's something to be aware of. I would like you to just click around and look at these, especially if you want to look about, it talks about enhancing your career. If you want to write and publish, do research. They got a bookstore, etc. Membership saves you a little money. And then the second one, okay? The second on the next page is the state of Nebraska ESL webpage from the State Department of Education. And from there, you can go to, in fact, you'll see on this particular one from Allison Olson, who was recently hired, talks about we have Google New Interpreter mode, makes it easier for teachers and parents to talk if they don't speak each other's languages. So I don't put a lot of faith in Google for translation, but at least it's something if you have nothing. Then it has all the sites, and you can see those down here, down the page. My copy's not in color, But this is a really good site. It tells you everything, how to set up a program, what are the standards of the program, what are the rules. I think it's Rule 15 controls this. How can you get help for your students if they're not ESL? Also talks about migrant education. There's a migrant office, because migrant or refugees or whatever you want to call it, migrant is a specific term. Migrant means someone who works in the field of raw products, either fishing, logging, or agriculture. That means working in a meat packing plant, working in an orchard, or working in a logging industry. We don't have that here very much at all, but some parts of the nation, like in California or Maine, would have a lot of logging. So these are important things to explore. I'm not testing you on this, so I mean, I'm offering this to you as an option. You'll need this if you're going to be an ESL teacher in the state and comply with the rules, because you'll need help, and they will give you help. They've done a great job of enhancing ESL instruction. Now, I put a third one in here, which a bilingual site is called Color in Colorado. Now to think about it, I thought, well, maybe that is Colorado. But anyhow, it is a site for bilingual or teaching with ESL students. And it's a great site, and it's available. All of these sites are available for you wherever you are. I gave you Nebraska because a lot of the students are connected to Nebraska. But your state has its own as well. And Color in Colorado is a great site, I think, in Colorado. It doesn't really matter where the website is, I guess. But it gives all kinds of instructions and ideas. And I like it because it's up to date, it's light, it's interesting. It's not just some dry government website with lists of officials and things like that. That's one of the great things about it. If you want to get scholarships, or you want to look for scholarships for your students that are ESL, you can skip through these and look for connections. Now, there is a site for bilingual education in the United States, but see, that doesn't really work if you're teaching, if your students are not Spanish speakers, because we don't do bilingual education or anything serious about it if they speak Arabic or something else. Not that that couldn't be done, but you would have to have a large number of speakers of a certain language in order to make it economic. So I recommend these three sites very highly. Now, another thing, I'm going to switch gears now, Dr. Stephen Krashen. And I have a video on there. You can click on there. It says, how do we learn languages? And it's got a 15-minute presentation. And this is a pretty old video, but I don't think the basic facts have changed significantly. He emphasizes some things that I wasn't taught years ago, but he concludes that we learn languages the same way, whether first, second, third, or fourth. Now, how we're taught will depend. You know, we learn our first language, English, from thousands and hundreds and maybe 1 million interactions with our parents and caretakers. We learn it from all kinds of little odd things that happen. We see a commercial, we remember something, an image, something scary like Pennywise the clown, we learn the word scary. But all this experience, we make sense of it because that's what we are. Our brain tries to make sense of it. And that's how we make language. We don't learn grammar officially, we learn it by practice. If you hear somebody say something odd in English, especially if they speak English, native speaker, and you think that's odd, why did they reverse the words? You know, why did they, that's not the way we talk. You don't know the rule, but you've internalized the grammar. Krashen makes the case that comprehensible input within a context, which helps make it comprehensible, is what makes a difference.
Quiet, boy brain.
That is my Three Stooges clock. It's not talking to you. So comprehensible input, a context and meaningfulness is and meaningful chunks of language. When I say chunks of language, I don't mean little snippets, but I mean when people say, "What's up? What you doing?" That's not written down. If you were to phonetically write that down, it's not "What are you doing?" It's "What you doing?" That's the slang or speaking. Speaking is always primary in all languages until the point people get civilized and start to write down everything. Then we worry about grammar, we worry about form and capitalization, things like that. But languages are primarily spoken, speaking and listening. And that's my weak point in Spanish. My listening skills aren't very good, although I hear better than I thought I did. So if you're learning a language and you're being taught French or Spanish or something, you'll find that historically, in most places, people didn't learn to speak the language. They learned to write down vocabulary words. But that doesn't work on the street. You can't scribble things down because literacy is not assumed. It wasn't historically assumed that everybody was literate. So writing was special. It was just for certain people. Now we want to say that everybody can read and write. We hope, but primarily, if you don't get the ability to speak and listen well when you're learning a language, you're really missing the main part of it. Nothing makes you feel cooler than ordering and talking and conversing in a language. Makes you feel smart and cool and everything. But if you have to look in a dictionary and stutter, it's not very, and you don't know because you're thinking all the time, that's not very helpful. Krashen is a very interesting fellow. He's old now, but he was one of the early people to really attack this worship of grammar and analytical approach to language. Language is automatic. Language is within the context. And we know that because a lot of times, even though we don't, nonverbals are huge because I can tell what's going on without ever anyone saying anything in English. Now, with other cultures, it depends on the motion, on the body language, depends on expressions, the context, etc. But we develop all kinds of skills in our own language. When we learn a second language, we have to relearn things, including the culture. So now he talks about the language acquisition device, LAD. That's not a young man that helps you with language. Language acquisition device is something that Noam Chomsky, a theoretical linguist at MIT, speculated that, and what it means is that we in our brain have all humans, assuming there's no damage or something happened, all humans have the capacity to learn language. Now, we also know animals learn language. In fact, they may be very sophisticated, but they speak a different language and they communicate in ways different than us. So people have done experiments where they studied songbirds or different types of birds, and they found they have accents and they vary from region to region, but they also found that they have certain sounds they make, and one sound means a dog or a cat is in the area, some kind of predator is a threat. And it's not just, the sound is like language. It's not just yelling out, watch out. Obviously, it doesn't function quite like a language, putting together all kinds of different sentences, but they have a pretty diverse series of songs or sounds they make. Same thing with squirrels, same thing with all kinds of animals, whales. So there's a lot to be studied there. For a long time, people were so insistent that humans are unique and every other animal has no capacity. Well, now they found that certain birds actually use sticks as tools to scratch themselves. So the definition of what is a tool, well, yeah, it's not a computer, but the fact the bird can take something and use it. Chimpanzees and other apes make primitive tools to acquire food. We've seen crows or ravens that know how to take rocks and drop them in water and get the the water level in a glass to go up by increasing the volume by dropping rocks in there so they can get a drink. Problem solving. So that's really a gray area. It's human ego trying to say we're so unique that we're special in the whole world. He talks about how we acquire language, and we acquire it in a natural way. We acquire second language like we acquire first. The only difference is when we learn a second language, we're usually adults or older adolescents, like in Spanish class in high school. And that way, we are often people break it down and teach it very directly. You know, first you have the subject, then you have the verb, traditional grammar translation. And that's a way of analyzing writing and speaking even. But in fact, it's not the way we learn to speak. We learn to speak, I almost call it abracadabra, but we learn phrases within a context. And as we hear the phrase and become familiar with it after several repetitions or experiences, then we're able to produce the sound. One of the rules for this is you cannot produce a sound unless you can hear it. It may sound odd, but it means that if you hear someone speaking in a language and you can't make out what the sounds are because they're so very different, and I've heard this with some of the individuals from Africa, their tribal languages, then you can't produce a sound, you can't communicate. Because when you listen, you just hear something, but you can never identify. So it takes a lot of work and a massive amount of detailed listening and experiences with that culture in order to begin to speak it. We teach languages the grammar translation way, the old-fashioned way for thousands of years. That's kind of how it was taught. And we teach it because that's the most direct way. And we explain the language in our own language, and we explain what first, second, and third. There is great joy in learning a language purely without having it translated or anything, just through observation. That's why I'm wearing the hat. Children are like little Sherlock Holmeses. They learn language from observation and practice and mistakes. Now I present you, there's several of these, but I'm giving you two first examples of how languages are taught, and you're very familiar with them. The first is grammar translation. What is that? That's the old-fashioned grammar class. We need a noun, the subject of the sentence. We need an adverb or a helping verb, then we need a verb, and then we need the object of the verb if it takes an object, like I threw, verb, the ball to Helen. I threw the ball to Helen. And we say to Helen is the indirect object, and through is the direct object. The direct object meaning, I think I'm getting these mixed up now I think about it. That's the problem with grammar is you have to think about it, and then pretty soon you're inarticulate. But the key is that you're analyzing the function of the place in the sentence. And the problem with that is that when I'm asking a question in Spanish, and let's say it's an emergency or kind of emergency, and I lost my hat, or I lost my partial plate in my mouth. You'll have to trust me on it. It's there. Okay. If I said that, and I said, no tengo mis dientes artificiales. I don't know what you say, partial plate. And you'd say, you lost. Tengo. I don't have my artificial teeth. ¿Dónde está? Está perdido. They're lost. Okay. I'm thinking my message has to get through to the person at the hotel to help me realize I left them behind, or I put them in the sink, or I flushed them down the toilet, or something horrible. That's what's happening. Language is usually spontaneous. And if you don't speak the language, then you get your dictionary out and you try to conjugate a verb. If you don't know the language at all, you're in a world of trouble. That's why they have these little tourist things. you can point at, saying, I lost something, and then explain what it is, hopefully. The grammar translation is an old standby. People that, I call it the analytical way to teach. It's also very slow, dull. Most of the time it's taught in a way that's slow and dull and uninteresting. I've got examples on the videos. If you just click on those, you don't have to watch them all the way through, except of course this one. But if you watch, you'll see that I've got one of an Indian lady teaching, and she's got the noun and the subjects, and we kind of conflate those together, but the noun of the sentence, generally the subject of the sentence, because nouns can be the object of the sentence, who knows. But she teaches it very structurally. And people like to see that when they're studying, because it's easy to see, oh, I see the structure. But that's not the same as interacting, because the structure for English grammar is in our heads. People say, well, why do you say it that way? And then I can't give a rule because I just know what the rules are. I don't know the reason for the rules. Now, grammar books, handbooks, we used to have handbooks that had all the rules for using the and a and an before a noun. Like, a duck is in my pond versus the duck is in my pond. Why can't you say and duck is in my pond? You know the reason? It's grown out of the sounds. And before certain nouns, consonants, you can't use and. I could say an olive is in my drink. I can't say the olive in my drink unless I mean a specific olive. But see, then you get into context, and that requires, if you don't know the language, you really can't really learn the language that way. You can explain it once you learn the language and you know the answer, but you don't know it at first. And trying to explain it grammatically is just kind of hopeless. But many adults study grammatically because that's what they think. That's what law school boards will say. You need to teach these kids grammar. Well, no, you need to teach them how to write and speak correctly. It's really what they mean. Teaching them grammar will not make a difference. Teaching them patterns of language, that might make a difference. So grammar translation has some advantages. It's very useful if you're studying language in theory, like I'm studying Navajo language, but I'm not going to learn to speak it. But I want to understand sentence structure in it grammatically, like I'm a linguist or something. It allows you to use your language, the first language, to explain the new language. It's easy to implement. There's a pattern. Everybody's used to it. It's like saying, yeah, everybody does it that way. It's not really the best way, but everybody knows it, so we'll make do with it. It's like we can all make coffee, but we can't all be baristas. We can't make good coffee, but we know how to pour the grains, the ground up beans that you buy at the store. They're already ground up. You know how to put them in a Mr. Coffee and make coffee, and that's pretty basic. But you couldn't go in a barista place and actually make coffee. Here are the disadvantages of it. It's not very interactive. It's all the teacher explaining. Kind of like I'm doing here. I know, but you're enthralled, I know. So it's not interactive. It's not very interesting. You can't explain things to people and refer to grammar as the basis for your sentence structure. They don't know the grammar, so it's a very specialized knowledge. It'd be like trying to cook something for somebody and you feel you have to explain the anatomy of the chicken. You know, why is there dark meat and white meat? Well, you analyze it and stuff, but people just want the taste. They want the sensation of eating the fried chicken. They don't want an explanation about the fried chicken. How's that for a metaphor? Now, the second one is, I gave you some examples. If you've ever seen Dead Poets Society, there's a little slice I have on the video. It shows a man teaching Latin, and Latin is the ancient language of the Romans. Other groups used to be in the Catholic Church. Very proper language, but essentially a dead language. A person who's boring is a person who speaks Latin as a conversational language. Anyhow, it's all based on grammar, and you have experienced this. When you went into Spanish class and somebody said, yo soy, I am, and then the familiar, to you, my friend you, tú eres, él or ella, he or she, es, es, nosotros somos, and then ellos son. Okay, so you'd say, soy, eres, es, somos, son. I learned Spanish that way. And I'm not opposed to using it to get people used to the sounds so they know the conjugations. You know, in English, we just add an S to the verb. We don't have all totally different forms. Well, for us, that's a little bit handy. You know, how do you conjugate the ER verbs, the AR verbs, and then some of the irregular verbs like UIR or something. If you don't know Spanish, this will mean nothing. But you have to learn those because we don't do that in English. But that still doesn't teach you the language. It does teach you the structure. So it has some value. All right, so they show Dead Poets Society, and then I have a Japanese class learning language with a grammar translation. And then I got one with Urdu, which is a little bit of a PowerPoint. And you don't have to watch these all the way through, but you get the point. It's very analytical. And what does it do? The student is so passive. You're just sitting there saying, okay, I understand. Okay, I understand. Okay, I don't understand. You ask a question. Okay, I understand. And it's not very, you don't do anything with it. And if you sat in a class that was like that all day long, you'd go crazy because you'd say, and a lot of people go through a Spanish or French class in high school, and if the teacher teaches that way, they come out saying, I can write things in French. I can read a menu. I can't ask anybody anything because I really can't use the language. Well, if you can't speak it, it's not very useful. So, all right. But it is a quick way to learn the basics of the language if you're totally blank on it and have no idea what's going on. All right, the audio-lingual method, very quickly, I already explained it here. After World War II, we wanted our CIA and our military and people going overseas, could be businessmen or people had a practical need. We say, well, I've got to take these guys who are not language learners, and I've got to teach them basic Vietnamese, basic Russian, basic Spanish, and I have to do it in like 9 weeks or 15 weeks. Well, how do I do it? Do I have them interact and have a good comprehensible input? I would love to do that. But because we're pressed for time, I'm going to make them sit in a chair, and I will make them practice a lot so they will be able to speak. And I'm going to have them listen to tapes or to exercises with a live person where they have to fill in the blank. And it's almost like grammar translation. The only difference is it's on tape. And you say things like, yo soy, and then you leave it blank, and they have to say, yo soy Glenn, I'm Glenn. Okay? Or me llama Glenn, I am called Glenn. If you remember llamar, it's a little different verb. I am called. I think that's right, me llama. Oh, well. The point is, it's done in a very systematic way to guarantee that in 9 weeks, this person will be able to ask 100 phrases or questions in Russian, and they'll be able to understand the response. Limited. It's like if someone wanted to teach you math and they had to do it quickly, they'd just have you memorize the multiplication tables, which wasn't bad. You know, A lot of times when we memorize things and we're so proud to memorize the, I don't know, Gettysburg Address or something, and you can remember it forever if you really get practice. Remember, the reason that we have the grammar translation and especially audiolingual, these harken back to the old days when there wasn't a written language and people taught you to oral history. Here's the story of the siege of Troy, the Greeks against the Trojans. And you'd sit there and say, well, what's the story? And you say, I'm going to give it to you in a song, and we're going to do it one phrase at a time, and you're going to memorize it, and you're going to be able to retell it. When I'm dead, you'll be able to retell it to the next generation. It's called an oral tradition. The brain is fully capable of memorizing vast amounts of information and reciting it. They call reciting or repeating it. And that's how we were taught. Mathematics tables, multiplication tables. We were taught to recite things. That was a big deal in the old days. People with a memory could recite a poem by Edgar Allan Poe or even a big chunk of a short story. It depends on what it was. People would say, oh my gosh, that's amazing. That's amazing. But that's not considered valuable now. If someone gives you sets down, tells you a short story or something from memory, you think, well, that's quite a feat of memory, but it's not very exciting, you know. A lot of times when people studying the Bible or in religion, there's a great emphasis on repeating the words because they say, oh, you know that verse, or you know that whole book of the Bible or that section of the Quran, or prayers. You memorize prayers in church. And so people feel that gives you a power. And you do feel, you know, that you've accomplished something. You know, if I could sit down and tell you a very long poem from memory, it'd be kind of a special little power. But all it takes is we usually aren't patient enough to do that. So what are the advantages and disadvantages? Well, the audiolingual method I just told you about gives you a certain result in a certain limited amount of time. Doesn't give you fluency, and it definitely doesn't make you a positive person about the experience because it's drill and kill. Both the grammar translation and audiolingual have this force feeding you. It's like giving nutrients to a horse to make it a racehorse. You're going to eat this feed bag and you got to eat it every day. I'm not going to spice it up. I'm going to make you eat this and then you're going to be a racehorse. Or it's drugs and you'll die after you race, whatever. Okay, now, what I want you to do finally is I want you to look a little video called Mrs. Amin's Twice Taught Lesson. Mrs. Amin is teaching a lesson and I want you to listen to it. It's very short. You can listen to it 3 times, but don't look at this when it stops in the middle and it goes quiet. I want you to go back and listen to it, the first part again. She's speaking in a language you don't know. I won't tell you that. I'll let you guess, but you can listen to it 2 or 3 times. And then I want you to see if you can pick out some words in it, because actually, even though it's a very foreign language, there's several words in it. I said, oh, I know that. I'll give you a clue, one of them. Chocolat, chocolate. What could she be teaching about? She's teaching a lesson to little kids, and she says chocolate. Finally, then you'll listen to it again the second time. You're watching it, I'm sorry. And you'll see that it's taught differently, and that is the key to teaching ESL, at least a big one, is realizing that you have to be real. I'll just leave it at that. Now, for your discussion, 2 paragraphs. First paragraph, I would talk about your language learning in high school when you try to learn Spanish or French. Was it a good situation? Could you function with Spanish if you'd been suddenly transported to Spain or Colombia or Argentina? In the second paragraph, I want you to talk about the grammar translation method or the audiolingual method. Would they be a good fit for the way you would want to teach? Now, I hope you get some feeling about watching these videos. You say, oh, I could never do that, or, oh yeah, I could do that. I could do that lesson. Now, you could do the lesson. Would the students learn from that lesson? This is the critical thinking. All right? Let me do some Zoom sessions so we can argue and talk back and forth. You know, you're lucky you're on this online class and you don't get to have a Wednesday night popcorn. Okay? You probably say that's great, but I miss it. I mean, I actually like you people. Okay, well, I want to thank you, and I'm going to get off here and save this.